Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kyle from Business Review, and I'll be your host today. It's our pleasure to have NSF International with us, who's presenting this webinar entitled Clinical Evidence for Medical Devices under Regulation EU 2017-745. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Kivia Pontes de Oliveira, Consultant for Clinical Affairs at NSF International. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar platform on 24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link you received via email to rejoin the session. If you want to ask any questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen, click submit, and we'll have some time at the very end to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But for now, please allow me to welcome Dr. Kivia Pontes de Oliveira. Over to you.
Hello, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Kivia Pontes de Oliveira, and I am here today to discuss the requirements of the Regulation 2017-745 regarding the evaluation and generation of clinical data. In the last years, I have been supporting several manufacturers during the transition from the Medical Device Directive to the regulation. This includes the evaluation of their clinical data and the preparation of clinical evaluations following the new clinical requirements for medical devices of Class 1 to Class 3. During this presentation, I will give you a short introduction on the regulation, analyze the definition of clinical evidence, go over the general requirements on clinical data, and discuss potential routes to perform a clinical evaluation. I will also indicate how to identify and generate clinical data and give an overview of the interface between the documentation of clinical data and post-market surveillance data. At the end, I will talk about some strategical steps on how to prepare to become compliant with the regulation. Let's start with the requirements of the regulation on clinical data. To understand the European regulatory framework for medical devices, it is important to clarify the difference between a directive and a regulation. Basically, a directive needs to be transferred into the national law of each country to become official, while in the case of a regulation, all requirements are directly legally binding in the whole European Union. The Medical Device Directive and the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive are currently still in place. On the 25th of May 2017, the regulation came into force with a transition period of 3 years, which means that it will become effective on the 26th of May 2020. If you have questions regarding transitional timelines related to manufacturer obligations, device registration, and validity of certificates, you may want to check out the Article 120 of the regulation. The European Union also has several medical device guidelines. One example is the Guideline on Clinical Evaluations, MEDDEV 271 Revision 4, the content of which refers to the current directives. With the regulation in place, guidelines referring to the directives are officially repealed. Therefore, a new revision of this guideline and/or additional guidelines of the European Commission are needed for further guidance on clinical evaluation. However, the recommendations from the current MEDDEV guideline are still consistent with the requirements on clinical evaluation from the regulation. We could even say that this guideline complements the regulation in the sense that it offers practical guidance on how to fulfill some of its requirements. So you might consider to still adopt the MEDDEV guideline in your own internal clinical evaluation procedure as an orientation to prepare clinical evaluation reports. Why did the European Union prepare regulation? After scandals affecting the medical device industry, the regulation was developed to improve human health and safety of medical devices. Significant reinforcements were made in areas such as supervision of notified bodies, conformity assessment procedures, conduction of clinical evaluations and clinical investigations, as well as vigilance and market surveillance. Furthermore, it is intended that medical device issues are soon recognized and that the authorities can trace a medical device from its production to its distribution. The final aim is to have a solid, transparent, predictable, and sustainable regulatory framework that nevertheless promotes innovation. When we compare the numbers of articles and annexes in the Medical Device Directive with the ones in the regulation, we can see that they have greatly increased. And this increase can be only partially explained by the incorporation of the active implantable Medical Device Directive. The regulation has in total 123 articles and 17 annexes, a large extent of which deals with requirements on clinical data. Here I have listed the most important ones. Article 61, which covers clinical evaluation, Articles 62 to 82, and Annex 15, which address clinical investigations, and Annex 14, which focuses on clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up. Today, we will concentrate on Article 61 and Annex 14. But if you plan a study for your device, I invite you to have a look at the requirements for clinical investigations as well. Article 61 of the regulation defines clinical evaluation. The aims of the clinical evaluation are to confirm the conformity of a medical device with relevant general safety and performance requirements, as well as to evaluate the undesirable side effects and the acceptability of benefit-risk ratio. A clinical evaluation has to be based on clinical data, and this data should provide sufficient clinical evidence, including, where applicable, data from the post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. In addition, a clinical evaluation has to be planned, conducted, and documented. Further instruction on how to proceed can be found in Article 61 and Part A of Annex 14. To better understand this definition, we need to explore the meanings of clinical data and clinical evidence. So, what are clinical data? Let's go to Article 2, the definitions. Clinical data are data coming from clinical investigations of the device under evaluation, clinical investigations or other studies performed using equivalent devices, reports on other clinical experience of either the device under evaluation or its equivalent device, and clinically relevant information coming from post-market surveillance, in particular, the post-market clinical follow-up. At this point, I would like to highlight that the post-market clinical follow-up is not a new concept, but it was not mentioned as part of the definition of clinical data in the Medical Device Directive. To better understand the last part of the definition of clinical data, we need to go to the definition of post-market surveillance, PMS. Manufacturers are required to implement a post-market surveillance system to collect and review experience data from devices placed on the market, so that they can immediately apply any necessary corrective or preventive actions. A PMS system should also include post-market clinical follow-up activities, PMCF, which is a continuous process to proactively collect clinical data. We will discuss methods for gathering PMCF data later in this presentation. For the moment, just keep in mind that the definition of clinical data in the regulation makes it clear that the experience gained from devices placed on the market is a source of clinical evidence on safety and performance of a device. In addition, the regulation defines the term clinical evidence as sufficient amount and quality of clinical data and clinical evaluation results of a device, which allow the assessment of whether this device is safe and achieves the intended clinical benefits. The regulation adds that the level of the necessary clinical evidence is directly dependent on the characteristics of the device and its intended purpose. Definitions brings us to another question. What is sufficient clinical evidence? To help clarify this term, we can consult the MEDDEV guideline. There, we read that the amount and quality of data are important criteria that should be taken into account to define what is sufficient. Let's go a little bit deeper into these definitions. By amount of data, we can understand how many aspects of the medical device are covered by data. Is there data showing that the device can be successfully used for its purpose and indications? Has the device been used for the intended target group? Does it do what has been claimed? Is it safe? Is it still one of the best technologies on the market, at least for certain indications? By quality, we can ask ourselves if we can trust the data, their analysis, and their source. Which types of investigations have been performed? What was the study design? What was the level of evidence of the study? Were the statistical analysis and its conclusions correct? Did the study follow ethical and legal aspects? And so on. In the end, the manufacturer has to specify and justify the level of clinical evidence necessary to demonstrate conformity of its device with the relevant general safety and performance requirements, as well as provide clinical data accordingly. The notified body will then evaluate the data and the manufacturer's justification. Let's now talk about the requirements on clinical evaluation and the routes that can be adopted to conduct it. So, when should a manufacturer start considering clinical data? Basically, since the initial discussions about the product idea, at this point, it is recommended to do a preclinical evaluation, which includes a clinical evaluation plan and a preclinical evaluation report. Some questions should be asked are, is this technology new? Is there a predecessor or equivalent device in the market? Are there data showing that these devices are safe and perform well? Are there other alternatives for the same indications being used currently? Which are the advantages and disadvantages of my device? During the product development, it is the time to perform tests to acquire preclinical data showing the performance and safety of the device. In the case of implantable Class 3 devices, as well as Class 1 or 2 devices for which there is not sufficient clinical data available, it is also the moment to perform clinical investigations. Before the registration of the device, the clinical evaluation plan should be updated, if necessary, and the clinical evaluation report should be released. Finally, after the product approval, the manufacturer should have a post-market surveillance system in place, including post-market clinical follow-up activities. This data should then be used to prepare and update the post-market clinical evaluation plan and report. Before proceeding to the potential route to perform a clinical evaluation, I would like to spend some time to talk about a few special cases. The clinical evaluation of devices without an intended medical purpose, such as contact lenses and dermal fillers, shall be based on relevant data concerning safety, and the demonstration of clinical benefits should be understood as a demonstration of performance. In this case, important sources of data are the post-market surveillance and PMCF. If sufficient data from either the device under evaluation or from an analogous one are not available, a clinical investigation might have to be performed. There are also devices such as sterilization trays for which the demonstration of conformity based on clinical data is not considered appropriate. In such cases, the manufacturer should present an adequate justification based on the results of risk management, considerations about the interaction between the device and the human body, the clinical performance intended, and its claims. The demonstration of conformity will then be based on non-clinical testing methods alone, including performance evaluation, bench testing, and a preclinical evaluation. The need of a clinical evaluation, including a literature research, is also emphasized by the MEDDEV guideline. After considering the categories of medical devices for which more specific types of clinical evaluations are required, we will now look at the different routes which can be used in a clinical evaluation to show safety and performance of medical devices. These routes are called equivalence routes and clinical investigation routes. To follow the equivalence route means to adopt the clinical data of an equivalent device, while to use the clinical investigation route means to perform a clinical investigation to generate data for the device under evaluation. Because of the cost burden of clinical investigations, most manufacturers prefer to follow the equivalence route. However, to be able to follow this route, it is important to have in mind that you need an equivalent device that provides you sufficient clinical data, and you will have to have access to this data as well. To be able to evaluate the amount of clinical data needed and to choose between these two routes, think about the following points. Which is the class of your device? For a class 1 device, the amount of data to show clinical evidence will be much less than for a class 3 device. Is the technology in which my device is based new? If so, you might need to generate further clinical data. Is there an equivalent device in the market? Is there clinical data available from this device? When I perform literature research, are these studies in which either my device or an equivalent device has been used? Has my product already been for a long time on the market, and could I collect clinical experience data? To adopt the equivalence route, you should also make sure that a clinical investigation is not mandatory to your device. For class 3 devices, clinical investigations should always be performed, except if the device has been designed by modifications of a device already marketed by the same manufacturer, the modified device has been demonstrated by the manufacturer to be equivalent to the marketed device, and the clinical evaluation of the marketed device is sufficient to demonstrate conformity of the modified device with the relevant safety and performance requirements. Be aware that in this case, the notified body will check if the PMCF plan is appropriate and includes market studies to demonstrate the safety and performance of the device. In paragraph 6, it's also stated that the requirement to perform clinical investigation does not apply to implantable devices and class 3 devices which has been lawfully placed on the market or put into service in accordance with the directives, as well as if they belong to product types such as sutures, staples, dental fillings, dental braces, tooth crowns, screws, wedges, plates, wires, pins, clips, or connectors. However, only if the clinical evaluation is based on sufficient clinical data and is in compliance with the relevant product-specific common specifications. If the equivalence route is an option for your clinical evaluation, you should take into account the requirements stated in paragraph 5 of Article 61. In case of an equivalent device which is manufactured by another company, the two manufacturers shall have a contract in place that explicitly allows the manufacturer of the second device full access to the technical documentation. It's important to consider that a contract between two potential competitors to allow access to the technical documentation of the device is very unlikely to be prepared. However, be aware that it is not clear whether the regulation in this paragraph refers only to Class 3 devices and implantable devices, or also to the other classes of devices. After considering the previous explanations, it is now the time to evaluate if an equivalence route is indeed an option. Let's have a look at the requirements to demonstrate the equivalence of a device. According to Annex 14, Part A of the regulation, equivalent devices should share clinical, technical, and biological characteristics. Basically, most clinical and biological characteristics should be the same. Same clinical condition or purpose, same site in the body, same kind of user, same materials or substance in contact with human tissues or body fluids. And technical characteristics should be at least similar. The MEDDEV guideline also states that equivalence should be based on clinical, technical, and biological characteristics. Some of these characteristics should be the same. Equivalent devices should be used to treat the same clinical condition, have the same intended purpose, be used for the same site in the body, be used under the same conditions, and be made of the same materials. Be aware that regarding conditions of use, the regulation is less restrictive and considers that they can also be similar. It's also important to remember that equivalence should be demonstrated based on evidence. In summary, an equivalent device can be a predecessor device or a medical device from another manufacturer. But their technical characteristics have to be similar to the extent that there would be no clinically significant difference in the safety and clinical performance of the device. Considerations of equivalence also have to be based on proper scientific justification. Last but not least, the manufacturers should have sufficient level of access to the data relating to devices with which they are claiming equivalence. If sufficient clinical data for the device under evaluation is not available and equivalence cannot be claimed, a clinical investigation will be necessary. To perform a clinical investigation, keep in mind that claims and clinical risks of the device should be taken into account when preparing the study protocol. In addition, not only the regulation, but also standard ISO 14155, the Declaration of Helsinki, and specific requirements of the member states of the EU have to be followed. You should also become familiar with further information on EUDAMED, the electronic system on clinical investigation in the European Union, and on single submission. Regarding the requirements on clinical investigation, I also would like to emphasize that they went from approximately 2 pages in the MDD to approximately 20 pages in the regulation, which include information found in 20 articles and 1 annex. Unfortunately, we do not have time to explore these topics in depth during this webinar, but the respective articles and annex are indicated here for further reading. After talking about the routes that can be used to show safety and performance of a device in a clinical evaluation, I would like to further explore the identification of clinical data. As I previously mentioned, the regulation states that a clinical evaluation should be planned, conducted, and documented by the manufacturer. The steps for the preparation of a clinical evaluation are covered in Annex 14. However, not all the detailed steps are described there. In this sense, until a revised version of the MEDDEV 271 Revision 4 is prepared or other guidance are published, you might consider adopting in your internal clinical evaluation procedure the recommendations found in this guideline. Regarding the identification of clinical data in Annex 14, it is stated that available clinical data to cover the intended purpose of the device, as well as any gaps in clinical evidence, can be identified through a systematic scientific literature review. In addition, it is made clear that the clinical evaluation should be a thorough and objective and consider both favorable and unfavorable data. The clinical data should also be appropriated to the nature, classification, intended purpose, and risks of the device under evaluation, as well as cover the manufacturer's claims. In Chapter 8 of the MEDDEV guideline, sources of pertinent data are listed and include data from the manufacturer, such as pre-market clinical investigations, PMCS studies, which includes post-market clinical investigations and any device registries sponsored by the manufacturer, PMS reports, incident reports sent to the manufacturer, complaints regarding performance and safety, details of all field safety correction actions, among others. Sources of pertinent data also include data from the literature. This data can be related to either the device under evaluation or to the equivalent device. To obtain this data, a thorough, objective, and reproducible search strategy needs to be developed. Following this strategy, a search protocol should be prepared. Topics such as state-of-the-art and claims should also be considered. Regarding the state-of-the-art, you should think about medical alternatives in the market for the same indications covered by your device. Also, consider applicable standards, guidance documents from medical societies, critical components, and the specific patient population for which the device is intended. The MEDDEV guideline also emphasizes that both favorable and unfavorable data should be taken into account. Also keep in mind that the term medical alternatives is mentioned as available alternative treatment options in the regulation. Regarding claims, it is important to highlight that the Article 7 of the regulation explicitly says that it is prohibited to use text, names, trademarks, pictures, and figurative or other signs that may mislead the user or the patient with regard to the device's intended purpose, safety, and performance. So be sure to screen the marketing claims of your device, including website pages and marketing brochures for clinical claims that need to be covered by clinical data. Clinical claims should also be included in your literature search protocol. Remember that all clinical claims have to be substantiated with clinical evidence. After talking about the identification of clinical data, let's move to the documentation of clinical data in interface with post-market surveillance. Not long ago, the term clinical evaluation would be associated only with the preparation of a clinical evaluation report. However, the preparation of a clinical evaluation report involves a continuous process to acquire and evaluate clinical data. This data should then be documented not only in the clinical evaluation report, but also in a number of other documents, the requirements and update of which differ accordingly to the medical device classes. In the next slides, we will go to the requirements for the preparation of these documents. As previously mentioned, a clinical evaluation report is mandatory for all classes of medical devices. But before preparing a clinical evaluation report, a clinical evaluation plan should be released. A clinical evaluation plan should include an identification of the general safety and performance requirements that require support from relevant clinical data, a specification of the intended purpose of the device, a specification of the intended target groups, a detailed description of intended clinical benefits to patients, A specification of methods should be used for examination of qualitative and quantitative aspects of clinical safety. Specification of parameters should be used to determine the acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio for indications and intended purpose of the device. Indication of how benefit-risk issues relating to specific components will be addressed. And, importantly, it should also include a clinical development plan. A clinical development plan should indicate the progression from exploratory investigations such as first-in-man studies, feasibility and pilot studies, confirmatory investigations such as pivotal clinical investigations, and planned PMCF activities with the indication of milestones and potential acceptance criteria. Following the clinical evaluation plan, a clinical evaluation report should be prepared. The regulation states that a clinical evaluation report should document the results and the clinical evidence assessed during the clinical evaluation. In addition, a clinical evaluation report is considered a part of the technical documentation. Regarding the update of the clinical evaluation report, in the case of Class 3 and implantable devices, it should be updated annually to address the data of the PMCF report. The clinical evaluation report of further device classes shall be updated every 2 to 5 years. As I previously mentioned, manufacturers of all classes of medical devices are required to implement a post-market surveillance system to collect and review experience data from devices placed on the market. For that, a post-market surveillance plan should be prepared and include important aspects such as how the data will be collected and assessed, investigation of complaints, protocol for communication, recording of serious and non-serious incidents, information on training reports, searches in the literature, databases and registers, including similar devices, and a continuous reassessment of the benefit-risk analysis. Data collected following the post-market surveillance plan are potentially important clinical data to be considered in the clinical evaluation. The post-market surveillance plan should also address post-market clinical follow-up activities. PMCF is a continuous process to proactively collect and evaluate clinical data throughout the expected lifetime of the device, such as the periodically performance of literature search or user surveys. Importantly, PMCF activities have to be performed according to documented methods laid down in a PMCF plan, which can be a part of the post-market surveillance plan. The PMCF data collected and analyzed should then update the clinical evaluation report. The results and conclusions from the gathered post-market surveillance data have to be documented in different types of reports, depending on the class of the medical device. In the case of Class 1 devices, a PMS report should be prepared, in which results and conclusions as well as preventive and corrective actions are described. The PMS report is also part of the technical documentation, should be updated when necessary and made available upon request. Manufacturers of Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3 devices have to prepare a periodic safety update report known as PSUR to summarize the analysis of the post-market surveillance data. The PSUR should include the conclusion of the benefit-risk determination, the main findings of the PMCF, the volume of sales of the device, and an estimated evaluation of the size and other characteristics of the population using the device. It is part of the technical documentation and should be periodically updated. Manufacturers of Class 2B and Class 3 devices shall update the PSUR at least annually. Manufacturers of Class 2A devices shall update the PSUR when necessary and at least every 2 years. As a suggestion, if you are a manufacturer of Class 2A or 2B device, you may consider using the same update frequency for the PSUR and your clinical evaluation. The PSUR should be made available to the notified body, and in the case of Class 3 and implantable devices, it should be submitted by the electronic system EQUIVALENCE. Finally, implantable devices and Class 3 devices should also prepare a summary of safety and clinical performance, which should include the identification of the device and the manufacturer, the intended purpose, indications, contraindications, and target populations, a description of the device informing if there are previous generations or variants, any accessories and other devices used in combination, as well as possible diagnostic or therapeutic alternatives. It should also include harmonized standards and common specifications applied, information on profile and training for users, residual risks, undesirable effects, warnings and precautions, and importantly, also a summary of the clinical evaluation and relevant information on post-market clinical follow-up. The summary of safety and clinical performance shall be made available via EQUIVALENCE and should be updated annually. To summarize, the documentation of clinical data involves not only the clinical evaluation report, but also the documents related to post-market surveillance. Briefly, the main communicating element in this process are the post-market clinical follow-up activities. During the preparation of a PMS plan, PMCF activities should be described. These activities should also be considered in the clinical development plan, which is part of the clinical evaluation plan. The results and conclusions of the PMCF activities should be part of the clinical evaluation report, which in turn is also an input for the update of the PMCF plan. Finally, PMS and PMCF activities should also be considered in the PMS report, in the periodic safety update report, and in the summary of the safety and clinical performance. The summary of safety and clinical performance should also include a summary of the clinical evaluation. We are now coming to the end of our webinar, and before I leave, I would like to share some insights on how to perform the transition and fill in the gaps to become compliant with the regulation. The good news is that if your device is already compliant with the MEDDEV guideline, you are in a good path. It means that you have already considered the technology of your device in relation to the current state of the art and the medical alternatives. You have also already identified clinical data to provide sufficient clinical evidence for your device. So now, it is the time to reevaluate the clinical data available by performing a gap analysis. Ask yourself the questions: does my device have an equivalent device? Does the equivalence still apply? How long has the device been on the market? Are there enough clinical data from clinical experience? Is there a PMCF plan in place for the lifetime of the device? If so, should it be updated? If there is no longer sufficient clinical data, should I conduct PMCF studies? Also, do not forget to update your SOPs and templates accordingly. If you have previously used clinical data from an equivalent device which no longer fulfills the regulation requirements of equivalence, or if your device has been for a long time on the market, but there are not enough clinical data available, or for other reasons you have determined that further clinical data is required for the registration of your device under the regulation, you might consider collecting clinical data now, during the transition period, with your current CE marked device by performing a PMCF study. If you have only small gaps on clinical data, you can instead plan and perform other PMCF activities. Potential sources of new clinical data are prospective or retrospective studies, registries, hospital information systems, as well as user surveys and literature search. PMCF activities can be a cost-efficient way to acquire clinical data and show clinical evidence for your device. In the end, there might be no need for an equivalent device for the registration of your device under the regulation. We now reach the end of this webinar, and I guess that there are a lot of information which needs to be processed. So please do not hesitate to contact me if there are any upcoming questions after the webinar. Thank you very much for joining today. Now, I will hand it back to the host for the Q&A questions.
Thank you very much. It is time for the Q&A now. So a quick reminder on how this works to everyone. To ask your questions, just type them into the box in the top left-hand corner of your screen, click Submit, and then wait to hear if your question is read aloud. But I see we already had a few come in, so we can just get started. Our first question today is it still possible to have equivalent devices from another manufacturer under the regulation?
Yeah, in principle, yes. It became more difficult to justify the equivalence, though. As I mentioned in the presentation, equivalent devices should share clinical, technical, and biological characteristics. Most of the clinical and biological characteristics should be the same, and most technical characteristics, such as design, conditions of use, principles of operation, should be at least similar. You can check Annex 14, Part A, Paragraph 3, for the complete list of requirements on these characteristics. However, if you compare these requirements with the recommendation from the MEDDEV guideline, they are most the same. What changed now is that according to the regulation, if your equivalent device comes from another manufacturer, the two manufacturers should have a contract in place that explicitly allows the manufacturer of the second device full access to the technical documentation. This information is stated in Article 61, Paragraph 5. However, this paragraph refers to Paragraph 4, which talks only about implantable and Class 3 devices. So one could think that the requirement for the contract between two manufacturers only applies for these specific classes of devices. In addition, what I also would like to share with you is that in some cases, manufacturers are performing tests using their devices and the devices of competitors to show the similarity between them and filling the gaps of equivalence.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got another question saying, you mentioned that clinical claims should be substantiated with clinical evidence. What are exactly clinical claims and how should I provide clinical evidence for them?
Clinical claims are a term present in the MEDDEV 271 Revision 4. They mean claims about the clinical performance or benefits of a device. For instance, if you say that by using your device you can decrease bleeding during surgery, you should analyze this aspect as part of your clinical investigation or PMCF study, in case you are planning one. If you are doing a literature search, you should also add a search term to look for publications that have addressed the amount of bleeding during surgery when using your device compared with similar devices available. The Article 7 of the regulation makes clear that all types of claims, so not only the clinical ones, that somehow may mislead the user or the patient are prohibited. So make sure to clarify with your marketing and regulatory department if their claims about the device under evaluation are substantiated. In addition, some marketing claims may be of technical nature. In this case, preclinical tests should support them.
Okay, very good. Someone here has asked, what are medical alternatives and are similar devices from competitors also medical alternatives?
Medical alternative is also a term from the MEDDEV 271 Revision 4, which is mentioned in the regulation as available alternative treatment option. So it does not mean the direct competitors, which use the same technology, but other technologies available in the market which are used for the same intended purpose. For instance, for the treatment of a certain disease, a physician might choose to use an endoscope or to go for open surgery. It could be that for a certain patient group, endoscopy would be the first option, whereas for another one, open surgery would be the best option. To learn more about alternative treatments, you can look for guidelines of medical associations, for instance. In addition, a physician should also be consulted whenever possible.
Okay, thank you. Question here asking, what does state-of-the-art mean?
State-of-the-art in Europe means what most people are currently using. It does not necessarily mean that it is the newest technology, because sometimes it is not clear whether this new technology is the safest one. You should think about it as a risk-benefit analysis and its relationship with other medical alternatives. A new technology may slightly improve performance, but its risks may be higher than the ones from another technology that has been already long in the market and has been routinely used in hospitals and clinics. The evaluation of the state-of-the-art, in most cases, is not a yes or no decision. It could be that for specific patient subpopulations, a device is more precise or less risky than others. In case of diagnosis, for instance, it could be that for unclear scenarios, an MRI would be necessary, while for most patients, an X-ray should be already sufficient. Here again, assessments, reviews, and guidelines from medical associations might help you to identify in which scenarios your device is the state-of-the-art. If a device no longer is the state-of-the-art, you should then consider the modifications that are necessary on its design, for instance. One example here are old syringes that did not have any protection against needle sticks injuries, and new ones that had sharp injury protection. Remember that the state-of-the-art of a device should also be discussed in the session of risk-benefit analysis of the clinical evaluation report.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here asking, are there differences between a pre-market evaluation report and a post-market evaluation report?
A pre-market evaluation report, as the name says, is a clinical evaluation report prepared before the device enters the market. This report is part of the technical documentation and should be submitted to the notified body together with other documentation for market approval. The main difference in relation to the post-market clinical evaluation is that this report does not have PMS data from the device under evaluation included, but it should have already a PMS plan, which includes PMCF activities. The post-market clinical evaluation will afterwards address the results of these activities.
Okay, and someone here has asked, is a clinical evaluation plan mandatory for all devices? How about devices which are already on the market?
Yes, it is. The clinical evaluation plan is part of the technical documentation, and the notified body will want to see it as a document separated from the clinical evaluation report. For new devices, it is expected that a clinical evaluation plan is already prepared during the development phase, so that the manufacturer can plan all the activities that are necessary to collect or generate clinical data to show the safety and performance of the device. For devices which are already in the market, you can prepare a clinical evaluation plan retrospectively, and you should also add PMCF activities, meaning activities that you will perform to regularly collect new clinical data. It could be the performance of literature research, user surveys, or even a PMCF study in case it is necessary.
All right, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, which just leaves a big thanks to Dr. Kivia for his great presentation, and of course to NSF International for sponsoring this session. To everyone watching, you're going to receive an email shortly letting you know how to access the on-demand version of this webinar. Or you can always watch this through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. Thank you all once again, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.